The power of reinvention is the secret of longevity in the music business. From Bowie to Madonna, the artists that evolve are the ones that stay relevant. And few artists have reimagined their musical careers so successfully than this week's guest, Midge Ure. Midge got to number one with If I Was, but when it comes to the history of British music, he doesn't have to speculate. He was in a boy band that got to number one, a punk band, a rock group, a new romantic group, a pop synth outfit, and a successful solo artist. He's a guitarist, keyboard player, lead singer, writer and performer who wrote and produced Do They Know It's Christmas and helped organise the most iconic concert in the history of music. We talked about iconic tracks like Vienna and Fade to Grey, Phil Lynot's lead singer energy, turning down Malcolm McClaren's offer to join the Sex Pistols, and how Band Aid and Live Aid came together. Enjoy. Hi Midge, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining me. I always like to start with a fun question to get the creative juices going. And my question to you is this. You're associated with one of the greatest collaborations in musical history. But if you could choose to create a band from the history of all music, who would be the band members and who would write the songs?
So dead or alive? So,
yeah.
That's That's
But
that's
not the
quite
band Dead or Alive.
that's quite a no, not the band Dead or Alive. That's quite a task. I think I'd have to have Mick Ronson, who was the David Bowie's guitar player during the Ziggy Stardust, Aladdin Sane period, and I knew Mick, and just about every guitarist I know was influenced by his style. So he'd have to be there to play either piano or guitar. Doesn't really matter. I think someone who gets a short shrift as a drummer is Ringo Starr. When you listen to what he did with the Beatles, it's not straightforward. It's very complex what he does, and he thinks outside the box. So he's incredibly creative as a drummer. So let's say he's on drums. And bass player, again, I think I would go for Mick Karn, who again I also knew and worked with over the years. Mick was the bass player in the band Japan, and he developed a really incredible, unique style. So I think that's probably a core band, and I'd be in it somewhere, strumming the guitar or hitting a tambourine or, singing a song or whatever. But yeah, songwriters, they are, I think they would all have to take turns. It's the only fair way, isn't it? Look at the Beatles. Lennon McCartney kind of outshone everybody else, but George Harrison was a great songwriter as well,
Very good. I don't know if this touches on the next question, but who were your musical influences when you were growing up?
Oh, different ones. Everyone has them. Everyone has favourite types of music or favourite songs. And you can probably map out your life, and what you were listening to at 13 is radically different from what you were listening to at 16. As you grow up and you realise your siblings are listening to what you were listening to, and you don't want to listen to that anymore. So you evolve. It's like I've described it in the past as like going down a corridor and there's a door in front of you, and you open that door and you go in and you're exposed to a type of music you didn't really know existed. And you walk through that part of the thing, and that piece of music sticks to you, or that type of music sticks to you, and then you open another door and you're taken into somewhere else. So I can pinpoint from the very early days, listening to the kind of Liverpool sound back in the early 60s. So the Beatles and Jerry and the Pacemakers and all of that stuff. The Shadows, big influence. Hearing an electric guitar for the first time was just mind blowing to me. All the way through to the Small Faces in the late 60s. John Mayall's Blues Breakers, Eric Clapton, all of these guys in the 70s, discovering David Bowie and Roxy Music and all of those things, into the whole electronic thing when we were exposed to what was coming out of Germany, the Kraftwerk and Neu and Dusseldorf and all of this stuff. And it's like a diary. You could say to me, okay, that piece of music, like we all can. That piece of music comes on the radio completely out the blue. You weren't expecting it. You know it, but you can instantly tell and remember who you were hanging out with, what you looked like, what you wanted to be, what you were into, who the girl was you fancied, all of that stuff. And that's the power of music. And it happens to us all. You don't have to be a musician for those things to resonate, It's like sprinkling magic on someone, those moments in our lives will always be there, and they'll always be peppered by a soundtrack. And we've all got a different soundtrack.
So you started work as an engineer, and in 1972 you joined the band Salvation as a guitarist. Were you convinced that being a musician was going to be your career?
Oh, I breathed music. I was born in a tenement slum in the outskirts of Glasgow, and radio was a big saviour. Radio was like was my TARDIS, my time machine. You listened to a piece of music and it took you away from the reality that you were in. But everyone I knew was in the same reality. Everyone I knew lived in the tenements, but music was always there. And I could draw a guitar before I could play one. And I plagued my parents for a guitar for years. And when I was 10, they managed to get me a second-hand, beat up old guitar, which I still have. And I taught myself how to play this. So music was always there, but the reality of having a career in music was so incredibly slim. Everything was London-centric. The record labels were down there, the clubs were there. I wouldn't have known how to make my first step into an area like that. But as you do, you get yourself your sensible job. My dad was a van driver all his life, and he wanted my brother and I to have a proper career, an engineering apprenticeship, get a trade at your fingertips, which was the be all and end all back then. You got a trade, you could work for the rest of your life. So I went down the sensible route. I left school at 16. They didn't teach me anything that I was particularly interested in. They wouldn't teach me music, which is pathetic. And I went down the engineering apprenticeship thing. And it was important that I did that for my family. But of course, I was playing in bands at the weekend. And that's when I got I didn't get the audition. I didn't actually go for the audition. I went for the audition to join Salvation with the keyboard player who was in my band, who we didn't really like very much. And he was auditioning as a keyboard player, but they asked me to play guitar while they were auditioning him. And suffice to say, they offered me the job and they didn't take him. So I had this dreadful scenario where I had to go home and sit with my parents 2.5 years into my 4-year apprenticeship, the job of their dreams, for their son, and sit down and say, I've had this opportunity. It's going to pay £25 a week, which it never did for years. It's going to pay £25 a week. This is what I'd love to do. If you don't want me to do it, I'll finish the apprenticeship, but then I'll never go back. I will play music. And I could see my dad crumbling. He was thinking, oh, God, no, this is not going to happen. But my mother ruled the roost, and she said, follow your heart. And that was it. They let me do it.
Amazing. So it's the early 70s in Britain. There's political upheaval, industrial unrest, and Scotland is leading the charge for the nation overall as the only country in the UK to qualify for the World Cup. And Scotland's also helping to redefine the music scene with the Bay City Rollers, the prototypical boy band that went on to sell over 100 million records. That's something between 100 and 300, depending on who you ask, which is incredible, really. I love them, I have to say. But can you talk about your experience of that time as Salvation turned into Slik? You became the lead singer in the band, and you had your first number one with Forever and Ever in February 1976.
It was a strange time. Yeah, Salvation, I joined as a guitar player. We had a lead vocalist. He quit, he threw his hat in the ring and disappeared for a bit. I kind of took over main lead vocals. We changed the name, cut all our long hair off. That was de rigueur at the time, shoulder length hair, and got James Dean quiffs. And we changed the name to Slik. And we were rehearsing in a ballroom above what was at the time one of the biggest music venues in the UK, the Glasgow Apollo. It was an old cinema, and it was massive. It held like 3,500, 4,000 people. And we were rehearsing up there because our manager at the time ran this place. And the Bay City Rollers writers, Bill Martin and Phil Coulter, Bill Martin, a Scottish guy, happened to be in the building. And he heard us performing or learning, because we had to play the top 40 hits, learning Sparks, This Town Ain't Big Enough for Both of Us. And he thought it was the record. So he stuck his head in, saw these four young lads, instantly signed us to some dreadful record deal, and said, right, we're going to make your first record. We turned up in London to make our first single with our truck full of all our equipment. We turned up at South Molton Street to Mayfair Studios. And as I walked into the studio to make my first record, I could hear in the background what sounded like a Bay City Rollers song playing, just this backing track. And that was our song. What they had done and what they always did back then was, irrespective of whether you could play or not, they got the session guys in to play the record for you. They played it. They did it in an hour or something, so it was cheap. But it was the same guys who played all the Bay City Rollers songs. So it sounded exactly like the Bay City Rollers. So I kicked off about this, I'm 20 or whatever, and I was dragged out into the middle of South Molton Street on a sunny afternoon and screamed at by Bill Martin, saying, get your arse up there and sing the effing song. This is a hit record, blah, 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 blah. And we had no alternative. I had to go in there and sing this thing. It got to number one. I got the phone call telling me it was number one. And a moment that should have been a highlight in your life, and, you should have been full of elation, I felt nothing, because it wasn't mine. It was my voice on it, but nothing else. So it was a really strange time. And of course, around that time, 1976, punk was just about to happen. So all the pin-up teeny boy bands, the Rollers and Kenny and, the Arrows and all of these bands that had been around and dominating the charts were all about to expire, because punk had come along and blown them out the water. So I didn't see what quite was coming. But I still had the decency, as the songs got worse and the records got worse with Bill Martin and Phil Coulter, I had the decency to say, I'm breaking the contract. I'm walking away from all of this, and didn't know whether I'd ever, go beyond that moment or not. So it was a strange time.
So, as you say, this is the time when the boy band or that kind of band was starting to maybe fall from favour. Glam rock was there, but that was beginning to fade, and punk was arriving. Now, I have to say, I was a bit of a London soul boy, so punk wasn't really for me. I didn't really get it, but I guess it appealed to you and Slik, and you decided to shed that band image and rename as PVC2, which is a very interesting name. What attracted you to punk, and is it true that you turned down the chance to join the Sex Pistols in 1975?
Yeah, PVC2 was just Slik. We had broken a contract. We were hoping to get another deal, which wasn't going to happen, really, in hindsight. I decided that we needed to make a record and just see what would happen if we didn't call it Slik, because we were already tarred with the boy band brush. So I took my reel-to-reel tape recorder, not multi-track thing, a reel-to-reel tape recorder, recorded the band live on this domestic tape machine, and we spent £2 making the artwork for the sleeve, and we got a deal. We got it released with Zoom Records, who was the first label, the first independent label in Scotland, which is the original label that Simple Minds signed to in Edinburgh. And they put it out, and it was the biggest selling record that Zoom had ever had, without anyone knowing it was Slik. So we'd already proved that part of your success can come with baggage. And once you have that baggage, it's really difficult to shake it off. But so by changing our name, putting this thing out, it was great. It was lovely. It was fun. But we were in the death throes of Slik. No one was going to sign us. We weren't going anywhere. I was coming out McCormack's music shop in Glasgow in 1975, and I was stopped in the street by who turned out to be a guy called Bernie Rhodes, who went on to manage the Clash, or he was partly managing the Clash at the time, or whatever. And he stopped me because of how I looked, because I had the James Dean quiff and I had straight trousers, none of your flares, none of your stack heel boots, none of that stuff. He just stopped me because I looked the part. And he asked me if I would go and speak to his friend round the corner in this beat up old Cortina or whatever it was. And his friend round the corner sitting in the car was Malcolm McClaren, who, again, nobody knew who any of these people were at the time. And Malcolm went on to talk about the bands that he'd co-managed. He talked about his shop. He talked about Vivienne Westwood. He talked about the clothes they were designing. And it became fairly apparent that what he was trying to do was put together a band who could be a clothes horse for the clothes that they were making. So here was I in this manufactured band, or what appeared to be a manufactured band, being scouted by someone else who was trying to put together a manufactured band. So he went on to tell me he was doing this band, he was putting these guys together. Was I interested in joining the band? And I said, no, you haven't asked me what I do. You haven't asked me if I'm a musician, if I play, or what I play, or, what. So I've got no idea what role he wanted me to do. I explained that I had my own band and we had a single coming out, the Forever and Ever one, and just I turned it down. Of course, the band transpired. It was the Pistols. So I to this day, I have no idea what vision he had. Was I Johnny Rotten or was I Paul Cook? I don't think it really mattered at the time.
So you left Slik in late 77, moved to London, and joined former Sex Pistols guitarist Glenn Matlock in Rich Kids. How did you find the move to London, and at what point did you discover the Yamaha CS50 synthesizer, which kind of led you away from punk and into the world of electronic music and Visage?
Well, I get, whatever plans you have in life, fate ignores. It just, things happen.
Man plans and God laughs.
Of course, absolutely. I got a phone call from Glenn Matlock, or the guy managing them at the time, saying Glenn's going to give you a call. And we spoke, and he said, I was speaking to the Melody Maker journalist Caroline Kuhn, who was a quite a well-known writer. She ended up, her and Paul Simonon from The Clash were an item for years and years and years. And she had seen Slik play live when we played in the New Victoria in London in 76. And Glenn had the nucleus of the Rich Kids, but no lead guy, or whoever this lead guy was going to be. And they tried various people, and she said, try that guy from Slik. He's great. So he called up cold and said, look, are you interested? And at that point, my band was nearly finished. So I jumped on a plane or a train. Maybe I couldn't afford the plane at the time, and came to London. Walked in to the rehearsal room where the guys were, met them all, learned 3 songs that Glenn and Steve had written, very new songs. We just arranged them all, did them all very quickly. Went out that evening in London, and we went to the Angel Islington to see the Police. And it was the Police before Andy Summers was in the, playing guitar. So it was the original lineup of the Police, and the support band hadn't turned up. So we got up and played our 3 songs as a support. Then we went to a warehouse party where there was Sid and Nancy, Susie and the Banshees, The Clash, Billy Idol. They were all there. All these people I'd been reading about in the music magazines, and they were all there. We got up and played our 3 songs there. Then we went to Camden, People's Palace, or whatever it was called at the time, Camden Palace, I think it was called at the time, and the Boomtown Rats were playing. So we got up and played our 3 songs there as well. Now this was baptism by fire. None of this stuff happened in Glasgow. I hadn't quite reached there yet. We didn't have that infrastructure. We didn't have the pub rock circuit that England had, because our pubs were run by the Scottish Church, and they refused to let people make money in pubs as entertainers. So we didn't have that there. So this was amazing for me. So I went back home, and I packed my stuff in the back of my £200 1954 Vauxhall Wyvern that I'd bought out the Saturday papers, and I drove to London, and it was quite an amazing thing. It was incredibly vibrant. It was scary. I'd left everything I knew behind, but the enticement of going out and being part of this madness was great. Of course, I ruined it 6 months in by buying a synthesizer, the Yamaha that you just mentioned. I was producing other artists at the time as well. I was finding my way around recording studios because I hadn't been allowed to touch a mixing desk. You know, sing, play, that's it. Don't come over here and see what's going on. And I was interested in how all this stuff worked. So I took some of the money that I made from doing a production and bought the synthesizer with a view to incorporating this fantastic electronic instrument into a rock band, you know, with traditional rock instruments. And it immediately split the band up. It instantly, you know, I used it on the one album the band made, and then it all went horribly wrong. Half the band loved the electronics and the idea of incorporating it, and half the band hated it. So after our first album, about a year into being part of the Rich Kids, it kind of crumbled and fell apart.
So you're a musician, a singer, and also a writer. If we take Fade to Grey, it's one of the most iconic tracks of that new romantic era at the start of the 80s. Where do your songs come from, both lyrically and musically? Yeah, because take a song like that, just as an example, we could pick any example. It's so iconic. How does that enter the world?
Well, that one was an odd one, Fade to Grey. And you know, when the Rich Kids were just about to crumble, about to fall apart, Rusty Egan, the drummer in the Rich Kids, and he's the guy who went on to open the Blitz Club and stuff. He was very connected to a lot of the music that was coming out of Europe, you know, this electronic music, and he and I came up with this idea of forming a side project, just a studio project, never to be a band, never to go out on tour, just a studio project called Visage. I came up with a name, I drew the logo, I designed all of that stuff. And the whole idea of Visage was that we worked with all our favourite musicians, one of whom was a keyboard player in Ultravox, who I hadn't met at the time, but we were big fans. And so we put this Visage thing together. I was working on the album, I was producing the album with the rest of the guys, with Steve Strange singing, and all the guys all contributing their parts. And I realised we were short of a song. At this point, during the Visage project, I ended up joining Ultravox. Ultravox had been on tour in America, came back a broken band. The singer and guitarist left. Rusty suggested that I was the guy that they needed. I joined the band, I was very excited. And my heart was with Ultravox at this point. So I'm in the studio and I'm trying to finish off the Visage album and start the first Ultravox album, the Vienna album that I was associated with. And I realised that we were a song short. Now, Billy, the keyboard player, had been touring with Gary Newman because Gary had just cracked it. So Billy had been touring with Gary Newman. I had just done a tour with Thin Lizzy to get the money that Ultravox needed to get up and running again. You know, we were starting from scratch almost. And while Billy was touring with Gary Newman, he used to jam a little riff, you know, this Fade to Grey, you know, all of that, with the other keyboard player. And when they came off the tour, they recorded it as an instrumental. And I heard the instrumental and said, look, you're doing nothing with this. Can I have it? And I'll use it for Visage, and I will write a melody and lyrics and turn it into a song. So it was an easy song for me to write because the music was so good. You know, the guys had done such a brilliant atmospheric job, and it just screamed at me. It was like I was being asked to write a movie for a soundtrack that already existed, which is the opposite way it should be done. Somebody presented me with a soundtrack, and I've got to fill in and tell the story. So it was a phase that I was certainly going through at the time. Again, we were all influenced by Bowie and his cut up lyrics and things that didn't necessarily have to make linear sense, but each soundbite, each word, each sentence created an image, created a vision. So I wrote the song based on that. The idea of film noir-y stuff. One man on a lonely platform, one case sitting by his side. It instantly makes you think, what's going on? Where's he going? He's on an empty train platform with a suitcase. He's travelling somewhere. He's going. He's running away. He's doing what? So I ended up writing the lyrics in that that form. Instead of fading to black, which is what you do in film, you fade to grey because no one sees him. He just disappears. So it had that mystique about it. And of course, that was the track that saved the Visage project. We put out a different single first that didn't really do anything. And then Fade to Grey just managed to, it was one of those songs that just captured people. It just got their ears, it got their hearts, it drew them in.
So you mentioned that around this time you also performed with Thin Lizzy and wrote with the legend Phil Lynott, who's probably the definition in many ways of an iconic lead singer. You'd been the lead singer in Slik. Steve Strange was the lead singer in Visage. Is there such a thing as lead singer energy? And how does that affect the dynamics of a band if it does exist?
Oh, there is. Oh, lead singer energy is absolutely imperative. Many bands can have different lead singers over the years, and it just does. It's different. Philip, Lynott was much more than a bass player. He was so charismatic, so charismatic. He encapsulated everything that everyone who had ever dreamed of being a musician, a rock star on stage, giving it all of that, the guitar, the bass, the legs a splay. But he had the voice to follow it up. He sang like nobody else sang. He had a power about it, and he did an intimacy about it as well. And to hear Thin Lizzy, blast out a rocker, then go straight into a really poignant, Still in Love with You, a really soft blues thing, and hear Philip singing in the way that he sang, it's almost like scat singing. It came from somewhere way deep inside, way down from his roots, from, 1930s, 1920s jazz, blues, whatever. It came through all of that. And he had that, So that power, it's much more than just a voice. And I remember Philip saying to me, I was in Japan with them, and it was early days for me as being a recorded singer. I hadn't really sung much in the Rich Kids. It was more shouty singing. And he said, he asked me which mic I used in the studio. And I said, well, I don't really know, whatever they stick up. He said, no. Then he quoted a mic. He said, that's the mic I use. He said, because that captures my voice perfectly. And I hadn't thought of it. I just thought a voice, words, notes, that's it. It comes out and it goes on the track, and that's what it becomes. But it's much more than that. It's capturing every essence and the syllable, the sibilance, and all of the stuff that makes up what the voice does. And it was only then I thought, okay, well, I've got to find my voice. I've got to find my sound, my vocal sound, because I hadn't really thought that you would have a distinct vocal sound. It just hadn't crossed my mind that I would have a distinct vocal sound, which I obviously have.
And apart from the technical side of things in terms of that lyrical definition, do you have to have a certain charisma to be a lead singer?
I'm not sure that's the case. I think you have to have something. You have to have the gall to stand up and do it, because you're the centre of attention 90% of the time. And you're the guy that most of the interviewers will want to interview, whether you're the brains behind the outfit or not, just because you happen to be behind the front microphone. I think it probably takes a little something, and it's almost indefinable what that something is. It'll be a concoction, the ego, the desire to be seen, the desire to be heard. I'm going to put it down to the fact I was crap at sports. I was always the kid at the end of the line when they were choosing who was in the team. I was always the one that, oh God, we've got Ure again. So maybe I'm trying to compensate for that. I'm the one all the girls looked over my head and didn't particularly bother with me. So maybe that's where it's all come from. If I was an analyst, I could put a therapist through their paces if I lay down on a couch somewhere and just started talking. Maybe that's where it all stems from, and maybe we all need that. We're all insecure. We're all as big as our last record. We all think nobody loves us. Irrespective of how many records you've sold or how many people come and see you in concert, it's still in there. There's this little thing. So maybe it's got something to do with that.
So you touched on Ultravox, where you rejoined or joined as singer, songwriter, guitarist, and second keyboard player. And you mentioned Vienna, which was released as an album in 1980. In January 1981, the single Vienna went to #2 in the charts. Now, if there was a list of great songs that made it to #2, Vienna would be, I'm sure, very much at the top of that list, probably alongside other classics like Wham's Last Christmas, and we'll touch on later the song that kept Last Christmas off the top of the charts. Vienna, on the other hand, was kept from #1 by Joe Dolce's Shut Up in Your Face. So, can you talk about the whole Vienna experience, from the beauty of the creativity all the way to that, probably, I can only assume, frustration that this piece of art was being thwarted by a thing? I don't know. It was hard to describe what that was, but it was Joe Dolce.
It was a thing. Yeah, I think when we created Vienna, when we wrote it, the band used to write in a rehearsal room all together, all four of us, and this thing grew, in a rehearsal room over like a 4-day period, and we actually had, for some of that, for most of it, we had an A&R guy, A&R, artist and repertoire, record company label guy, who are responsible for signing bands. We had an A&R guy come over from America to talk to us about signing the band. And he sat there while we created Vienna and didn't sign us. Every band's got a story like that. But we knew we had something special when we recorded that song. It was never meant to be a single. It's too long. At the time, singles had to be less than 3 minutes long. This was over 4 minutes long. We knew we'd created a bit of a monster, but it was technically challenging to make, because it speeds up and it slows down, and it was a great joy doing it, because we threw out all the parameters in our head, all the areas that we would think, okay, if this is going to get played, we need to make it a certain length, right? We can't speed it up and slow it down because that just won't work, and we'd have to eliminate huge chunks of that piece of music if we were thinking in commercial terms, which we weren't. I joined a band that was as far away from Slik as I could possibly imagine. It was more like an art band, an art school band. They were creative. They knew a lot about electronics and how to utilize them. I turned up with my little synthesizer and got in there, and I felt like a kid in a candy shop. These guys knew more than I did, and I was sucking up all this information and energy from these guys. So we knew we'd made something interesting, and it wasn't until the label came to see us, because everyone started pointing this song out. Every place we played, it got an amazing response, even though it was just an album track along with the other album tracks. And the head of the record label came to see us and said, he saw us in Hammersmith Odeon, as it was called at the time. I don't know what it is now. And of course Vienna played, and the entire place erupted and stood up and clapping for ages. And the label guy said, we need to put that out as a single, but we need to edit it. And he said, well, what bit do you want to cut out? What, the intro? Because that's what sucks you in. The viola solo? That's quite important, Or the ending? What can you chop out that will still make this work, so you can get it on the radio? and they argued and argued and argued, and we were saying things like, get the same person who edited Hey Jude. Oh, it wasn't edited. Oh, interesting, wasn't it? Because that was 5 minutes long, and that got on the radio. So eventually they crumbled and said, "No, put it out as it is." And we were exceptionally lucky. Someone somewhere up in Manchester was playing it. We'd play it at night at 11, 12 o'clock at night in a late night show. And one of the pluggers from the record label kept hearing it at the same time as he was driving to and from doing his job for the label. He would hear it every night, and he'd go back and report it and say, "This is getting played. This is getting plays." So they kind of focused on it, and lo and behold, we got picked up. It was all of a sudden Radio One were playing it, and it was just an oddity. You couldn't sit down and sculpt something like that. The world was ready for it. I think people were tired of hearing all the Christmas songs over the Christmas New Year period and wanted something fresh. So this came out in January or February, whatever it was, started getting played on the radio. So it was not only different but fresh. And it just, again, one of these things that just resonated with people. So yeah, we're out there. This thing starts selling in droves, not just the single, but the album. At a time when I used to have to go down to the telephone box in the corner of the street in Chiswick and phone into the office to find out how the record was doing, because I didn't have a phone. You couldn't get a phone for 6 months in those days to get one fitted to your flat. And they'd say, "Oh, we got another order in last night for another 40,000 albums." And what? And then you go back at 6 o'clock that night and call up again and say, "Oh, they're all sold. There's another order in for." So this thing was just getting huge. We'd created this monster. It was amazing. So yeah, the fact that, yeah, Shut Up in Your Face, a comedy records, and not a very funny one either, I don't think. It got to number one. It reflected what the great British public musical tastes were like at the time. The charts were very diverse. There was room in the charts for everything, So they bought this thing. For us, everyone's thinking, "Oh my God, you missed out on the number one." We're thinking, "Oh my God, we got to number two with this thing that we didn't bastardize. We didn't chop it up. We didn't do anything. It was never meant to be a single." So we're sitting thinking, this is amazing, because everything changed at that point. All of a sudden, we were elevated to bigger venues, to bigger tours, bigger budgets to make the next record. Everything had developed. Plus, you've got to roll into the equation the fact that we insisted on making, videos, pop videos, clips for the songs. We insisted on making a video for a first single from the Vienna album, which is a thing called Passing Strangers. So we worked with a guy called Russell McKay, who was a young director. We insisted it was shot on 16mm film. We cropped the screen top and bottom to make it look like CinemaScope. It was film noir. It went from black and white to colour. We created all of those, what were soon to become video cliches. So we did one for Passing Strangers. We didn't, and then we were lined up to do the Vienna video. So the parameters were already there. I remember the record label saying they didn't want to do a video because the song was already number 2 in the UK charts and it was starting to bounce around the world. And we said, "But you send us on a plane every Friday night to Milan or Berlin or whatever to go and do some crappy TV show when you could send the video and save yourselves all that money. Put the money in the video, and then you're giving a director 4 minutes of quality in the television show, if that's what you want. So then you own the rights. We can control what people are actually seeing, as opposed to standing in a TV studio surrounded by topless dancers or whatever it is you get in Italy." Because it used to be as bizarre as that. It was, why are we doing this? I remember going to one with some guy arc welding a piece of metal in front of us. When you get archive, you can really burn your retinas doing this. But so what's going on here? They wanted the sparks. It was just madness. So yeah, it was. To the outside world, it was incredibly depressing to us that we didn't get to number one. But had it got to number one, I don't think we'd be talking about it now, 40 odd years later.
So in 1985, you started a solo career, and in September that year, your single "If I Was" became a number one hit. How did you end up going solo. And how did your experience change as a solo artist, your experience of being a performer and the business?
It's a funny animal, the idea of going solo. I was still in Ultravox when If I Was happened. I kind of achieved what I wanted to achieve when I started making money within Ultravox. In the first couple of years or whatever it was, I was there with them. Money started rolling in, which was an unknown quantity to me. I'd never seen money before. I did what I always wanted to do. I built a studio, and everyone thought I was crazy because artists are flippant creatures. You know, you build a studio and then you never learn how it works, and then you read about a fantastic studio in Australia that you want to go and do your next album in, and then yours just sits there and gets covered in cobwebs. But mine didn't. I built a studio in the back of my garden, 24 track studio, and that gave me the ultimate tool because I realized that at some point my name on a list of other names at the record label, you know, when it got to the bean counters, they'd look at it and go, "Oh, he's not selling as many records as he did. Let's get rid of him." Well, they could get rid of me, but they couldn't get rid of the tools that I needed to make music. You know, in those days, a recording studio was 500 to £1,000 a day, you know, to record in. So I purchased a studio and started figuring out how it worked. And the best way to figure out how it worked was to record new material. So without realizing it, I'd recorded a bunch of instrumentals, a bunch of songs that I just worked on. No idea this was going to turn into an album, including If I Was. And then I played it to my manager and he said, "Well, this is an album." He took it to the record label who instantly wanted to put it out. So I was still within Ultravox doing that. We were still touring and still working and still writing. So I hadn't really embarked on a solo tour, a solo career. And it wasn't until being taken away from Ultravox for quite a while. You know, after If I Was, I'd booked a world tour, you know, around the world in 80 days, solo tour. And I thought when I get back from that, straight back to Ultravox and carry on. But that coincided with the aftermath of Band Aid and Live Aid. And as a Band Aid trustee, it kept me away from Ultravox for a long, long time. And when I returned to the band, we'd all changed, like you do. You know, nothing stands still. And what the guys had been writing in my absence, I didn't get on with at all. But I didn't feel as though I could say this needs to be scrapped and start again. So I went along with it. And the final album that we had made at that point before walking away from it all, it shows that. You know, I'd written a song called All Fall Down, which was a Celtic protest song because I'd been working with the Chieftains. So I had the Chieftains and Ultravox on this one track, whereas another song on there, Billy wanted to work with, you know, more classical musicians. So we had George Martin conducting an orchestra, playing, you know, All in One Day, which again I co-wrote, and the disparity was huge. You know, we were pulling in different directions on one record, and maybe had we stuck together and pulled through that and got refocused. You know, we even got rid of our drummer, Warren Cann. Warren was in the band years before I was there, and we had the audacity to ask him to leave. You know, it was the first signs of musical madness, and that album reflected it. So one day I just walked in and said, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to leave. And everyone else just said, well, I'm leaving as well. So we all left the band. I think maybe in the back of your mind you think, well, I was a quarter of Ultravox, so therefore a quarter of the hardcore fans will, you know, at least they'll follow me. It doesn't work that way. You know, there's something about the name above the marquee, or the name above the product, the name above the music, that entices people in. And because you've gone solo, it doesn't necessarily mean that's going to happen with you. So it really was kind of like starting all over again. You know, with a bit of knowledge. You know, your knowledge is still there, and your whatever talent you have is still there, but people see it in a different light.
So I guess in 1984, your life really changed quite significantly by Band Aid and the song "Do You Know It's Christmas." How well did you know Bob Geldof when his wife, Paula Yates, handed you the phone on the set of The Tube with Bob on the line decrying the famine in Ethiopia?
Oh, and I knew from the Rich Kids days, I knew Bob. And obviously, as I said before, we jumped up and played our three songs before. I think we maybe blew up one of the amps doing it as well, before the Boomtown Rats came on and performed. So if the Rich Kids were playing in Ireland and Bob happened to be there or whatever at the time, he'd come and see us. So we kind of bumped into each other a lot. And of course, Paula Yates was the kind of glue that held all of that together, all those relationships. Because Paula worked for Record Mirror or whatever it was. She was a writer, a very funny writer as well. And everyone loved Paula. Everyone loved her. She was just this bubbly, very intelligent, smart, beautiful woman. And she would pull everything together. We'd go around their house and have dinner and, whatever it was. So it wasn't unusual that I'm doing the Tube and chatting to Paula, who was hugely pregnant. And then she hands me the big old plastic Bakelite phone saying he's on the phone, he wants to talk to you. And that was it. I've seen this footage on the television. It's disgusting. I want to do something. Will you help? And I said, well, I'm back in London tonight or tomorrow or whatever. And then we sat down in Langan's restaurant, I remember, which was some kind of cool lunchy hangout place, talking about what we could do to raise £100,000, and it took us a long time to come to the conclusion that we're actually rubbish at everything except maybe writing a song, put a record out. That was it, After that meeting, I think Bob bumped into Gary Kemp from Spandau, and then he walked around the corner and bumped into Simon Le Bon, like you do, He lived in Chelsea. And I went home and wrote this funny little melody thing on my little plastic keyboard on my kitchen table, the da 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 da. And that was it. The seed of the idea had not just been planted, but it started to grow that day, which is just madness. And the rest, as they always say, is history.
And we've talked about lead singer energy in a band. What was the energy like in the room with all of those lead singers and solo artists? I mean, it must have been quite a place to be.
It was a brilliant place to be, but it was also very intimidating. As I've said before, we're all insecure characters. Nobody wanted to go up and sing the song first. Bear in mind, these days you can email someone a song, they can learn it in the car on the way in. Those days you couldn't. They hadn't heard the note. They didn't know anything about this song other than the fact it was a charity record. They all turned up on the strength of this being a charity record. That's it. So the idea of standing on a Sunday morning, hungover with a frog in your throat, standing behind a microphone in an empty studio with a camera in your face, while all your contemporaries are all face up, nose up, hands up against the dividing mirror between you and the sound booth, all waiting for you to go, it's Christmas time, it's horrendous. It's horrendous. Nobody wanted to overstep the mark. Everyone thinks that all those artists all knew each other. We'd seen each other on television, or we knew each other's music, but we'd not been in the same room together. So that's a kind of leveler, in a way. There's respect, there's fear, there's a bit of, oh God, I hated his last record. There's all of that stuff going on. And also all covered by this blanket of, my God, this is happening. This was something in my diary that I agreed to do, 2 weeks ago, and here I am, and all these people are here. It's just, and thousands of people outside, all clambering to see artists turn up. It turned into a three-ring circus, which it had to be. That was the whole point. You get all these people together, you make a record, you do this thing that is kind of slightly unheard of in the music industry, doing something for nothing, do it for free, do it for someone else. And we'd achieved that. There's a moment where I had to throw everyone out the studio when we were finished recording. It's like 8 o'clock at night. And I had to mix the records by 8 o'clock the next morning. So everything we'd recorded had to be sorted out, who's singing which part, laid out like a big jigsaw piece, a puzzle, and then mixed and balanced and ready to go to the pressing plants the next morning. And I'm trying to get this thing done, thinking of good, I've got a nice quiet studio. and Bob's on the telephone behind me. So I'm hearing one-sided conversation of Bob screaming at Robert Maxwell, saying, you're not getting a photograph for the front cover, because Maxwell wanted to use a colour insert that it was going to charge £1 extra for the paper or something. That pound was going to go to his charity. I think he had said that maybe Band Aid could have 50%, but our Bob was saying, no. 100% goes to Band Aid, or you're not getting a photograph. So this conversation, this screaming match, was going on when I'm still trying to mix the record and get it all finished. But we did it. And then I heard the thing on the car on the way home. Bob took a cassette, went to the BBC, and played it on the breakfast show. I think Simon Bates played a cassette. The BBC don't play cassettes, so I'm driving home and I've got the radio on, and I'm exhausted, and so's Bob, because we've been up all night. Very emotional, we just managed to pull this thing off. And I'm driving home and I hear the song I've just finished getting played on the radio for the first time from a cassette. And at the end of it, they rewound the cassette and they played it again. And that never happens, ever. And I went to bed kind of happy that day, that morning, to wake up to find that this was just all over the place, like some kind of plague that had just gone. It was everywhere. Everyone was talking about it.
Who impressed you or surprised you with their performances, their creative instincts, or just their willingness to be part of the group?
Oh, they were all willing. I mean, they wouldn't have gone there otherwise. I mean, we didn't approach the managements and stuff. We'd spoken directly to the artists. Bob had bludgeoned them all into coming along and doing it. So just prior to the whole recording, we weren't sure who was turning up because, as I said, artists are kind of light at times when it comes to taking detail. So we weren't quite sure who was going to arrive. I think Bono was great. U2 hadn't really cracked the UK to the extent they had done America. And I think when he went out and sang that line, this little guy, this voice, this huge voice just came blasting out. George Michael, great, of course. Paul Young, all the rest of them I knew, I'd heard them all singing live. They're all great. But Boy George just arrived on Concorde because he forgot. So he bought a ticket, came over in Concorde, turned up, heard the song. This voice came out. He sang it beautifully, and you think, okay, that's fair dues. He was in bed when he called them. So he got up, went on the plane, got back, straight to the studio, walked in, asked for a drink of something, and then we played it to him a couple of times, and he sang like an angel.
The following year came Live Aid. Were you a natural event organizer?
Oh God, no. Listen, there's a big difference between coming up with the ideas and being part of the team that helped push this thing through. Bob came in one day to one of the thousands of meetings we were having about distributing the Band Aid money. And he came in one day and said, because we were trying to break a cartel of trucks that were in situ that used to take all the goods, up country, up dry riverbeds and whatever. And all the aid agencies had to use this one trucking company, this cartel. And we wanted to break the cartel, but we didn't have the money, to buy a fleet of trucks. So Bob came in one day with this idea, this Live Aid thing. And Harvey Goldsmith, who's still big music entrepreneur, impresario, and Harvey's chin hit the table and said, "It's impossible. You can't do two concerts, across an ocean. Satellite telephony was in its infancy. Never mind satellite television. It was too big, but we kind of managed it. Harvey had the connections. He knew people who could put these massive, stadium events on. And I think Bob drove Harvey crazy. I mean, absolutely crazy. Because Harvey kept saying, no, it can't be done. No, it can't be done. Bob wouldn't take no for an answer. But I think if you gave Bob and I a spanner each and said, right, build a stage, work the PA system, get the lighting working, you work on the infrastructure, none of us would know what to do. We can stand on the things and we can perform on them, but how you put it together, it's a wealth of skills that goes into that stuff. So, we might have been the so-called driving force behind it or the ideas behind it, but my God, we couldn't have done it without the plethora of skilled people who pulled it together for us.
And again, same question as before, but with those live performances on the day, did anybody stand out for you as seeing them or being so close to them that they blew you away with how they performed in a way that you hadn't perhaps quite anticipated?
I think I was the dickhead musician sitting in the audience, going, "Who's coming on next? Oh, Elton John. This won't be very good." And of course, he comes on and he blows you away. There's a reason he's Elton John. Brilliant, and that's a name that just pulled out my head, not necessarily Elton John, but a variety of artists. I'd be sitting going, "No, I'm not sure. That's not my kind of thing." Wonderful. U2 were great on the day. As were Queen, of course. It was spectacular. Everyone did a different thing. They all had 18 minutes. Queen did a segued greatest hits, which really worked for them because it reminded the audience of just what a powerhouse they were. Bear in mind, Queen had been through some highs and lows in popularity at the time. They'd played Sun City and they'd done a lot of things, and it wasn't favourable. So they just walked on and just played this segued greatest hits, which was spectacular. And of course, Freddie was in his element. It's now been hailed as one of the greatest live rock performances ever. 18 minutes. Whereas you get U2, who come on, young lads playing their thing. They're supposed to play their new single, and they've forgotten because Bono jumped down and got the girl up dancing, and they had to keep this repetitive, hypnotic, rhythmic guitar thing going for ages and ages and ages, and then get off. And they got off thinking they had blown the biggest moment of their lives, and they had done the opposite. They were not the finely polished, finely honed crafters that Queen were. They were still raw and a bit wet behind the ears, but brilliant. So it worked in their favour as well.
So finally, I always like to end with a fun creative question. And so if I or anybody else asked you to put together your dream EP or playlist from the history of music, which 5 tracks would you choose?
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I'm going to have to do it in kind of chronological order, and the majority of this will be from the past, from old stuff, because I think that's when you're at your most malleable. So, as I said earlier, I remember listening to the Shadows when I was a kid and seeing these beautiful guitars on, my little 12-inch black and white television or whatever, and desperate for those. But prior to that, when I was still a babe in arms almost, or a toddler, I remember hearing a piece of music on the radio, because radio, as I said, was a lifeline. And it was a Sleepwalk by 2 guys called Santo and Johnny, New York musicians. One played guitar and the other one played lap steel guitar. And the sound of this lap steel guitar with a reverb on it was absolutely beautiful. So I'm going to put that down as one, because that's still a reference point. I'm going to say the Beatles' Hello Goodbye, because it's a nonsense song. And there was something about the quality of that getting played on the radio. You say yes, I say no, you say stop and I say go. It's a nursery rhyme. It's a baby thing. The lyrics aren't all, the be all and end all. You can sing nonsense at times, and people will read their interpretation into what you're singing. And it kind of emphasised the power of melody to me, because the melody of that song is just brilliant. It conjures up an era to me when I hear that on the radio. I'm going to say Kate Bush, Hounds of Love, Running Up That Hill. Again, the term genius in the music industry gets battered around a lot, but she truly, truly is a genius. We were around at the same time. We bumped into each other lots at the same time. Just outstanding, brilliant piece of music. Again, someone who's never really listened to what a label suggested. She's done her own thing and worked her, cut her own path through a very bizarre industry. I'm also going to say My Mind's Eye by the Small Faces. I remember watching television, watching Top of the Pops or whatever, like everyone did on a Thursday night at 7:30 or whatever, and seeing the Small Faces on with My Mind's Eye. And These little guys with great big guitars, much bigger. It seemed out of context, and I thought it can be done. You don't have to be 6 foot tall to be on stage. So at 5'7", I was really happy that there's these guys that had been out there and done this before me, and it was also a brilliant song. And I'll pick something reasonably recent. I'll get the name of this wrong. Sigur Rós from Iceland. Brilliant musicians. In fact, the singer Jonesy sings in a made-up language. Again, emphasising the fact that you don't have to understand what's been said to understand what the music's about. And they had a track that gets played on every reality TV show ever. We just kind of sullied it a little bit. It's not their fault. It's the TV shows. Every talent show, just when they're telling their heartbreaking story, and all of a sudden they're going to hit the red button, and this piece of music comes up, and it's called something like Hippopolina, and it's just this most beautiful piece of music, which I absolutely love. So that would be my EP.
Very good. Sounds very eclectic, but definitely worth a listen. Well, Midge Ure, thank you so much for being a guest on Here Comes Pod. It's been a fascinating walk really through the history of pop music. And personally, I've learned a lot. And it really has meant everything to me for you to be a guest on the podcast. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I love the pun. Thank you.
I'm a dad. I can't help it.